Okay, it's gonna be super short. Let's see how fast I can make it. If I can break my record, get to 5 minutes. We'll see how that goes. Okay, so this is our last lesson, and all we're doing is we're adding on one more little piece here, one more new term. Let's try and kind of break down what we've learned so far. We know that if two triangles are congruent, what this means is all their sides are congruent as well. Each side in each triangle has a corresponding congruent side. This side corresponds to this one, those are the same, this side corresponds to this one, those are the same, so forth and so on, as well as that all of their angles are congruent too, and they can correspond to each other. These two correspond to each other, those are the same, these the same, and these the same. So we know if two triangles are congruent, this is true. We also know that with only a little bit of information, we can know that the triangles are the exact same. Even if we don't have pictures like this, where all the sides are marked congruent and all the angles are marked congruent, we can know that they are congruent, even if we don't see everything marked. So for example, even though I don't see that the angles are marked congruent here, right? I only have the sides marked congruent. This is enough to say that these two triangles are congruent. And what's this congruency postulate? Side, side, side. So because I have one of those postulates, side, side, side is one of those postulates, I can know that the angles are also going to be congruent as well, even though they aren't marked. Now, we have a new term to work with then. What this term does is if we are trying to prove a part of a triangle is congruent to part of another triangle. So this is not saying this triangle congruent to this triangle. This is saying maybe something like, I want to prove that angle A is congruent to angle D. Well, if I know that these two triangles are congruent, I know that all their parts are congruent. So this is a long term, and we're going to shorten it to an abbreviation. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. We abbreviate this to CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. CPCTC. It sounds kind of like a drug. A geometry drug, yeah. And again, it states that if we know two triangles are congruent, then we know that all of their individual parts are congruent as well. That's all it says. So looking at an example here, here's how we know when to use CPCTC. You need to look at the proof. Notice this proof is a part of a triangle. I'm not trying to prove the triangles are congruent. I'm trying to prove that a part of the triangles are congruent. Specifically, that angle S is congruent to angle A. So I already have, this over a bit more. There we go. Now we can see this. The rest of the proof filled in. We have that T is the midpoint of SA, which is given up here, and that CS is congruent to CA. So if T is the midpoint, I'm just going to mark this on my picture here. That means that ST is congruent to TA. And then also we have CS congruent to CA. I'm going to mark those with 2 again to show that they're different. So there's my 2 givens. So I have my given. Notice here we said ST congruent to TA, and the reason was definition of midpoint. If T is the midpoint, that's why I know these 2 pieces are congruent. Oh, look, they also marked CT congruent to CT because of reflexive property. We talked about that. Remember, if 2 triangles are sharing a side, that's reflexive property. You are congruent to your reflection. And then let's go through the last 2. Notice I still said these triangles are congruent. I still need to prove that in order to prove that all their parts are congruent. Again, CPCTC says congruent triangles, corresponding parts of congruent triangles. So I first have to say the triangles are congruent, and then I can say, therefore, all their individual parts are congruent as well. So we are still going to say a triangle congruency postulate. Looking at our picture here, let's cover up one of our triangles. I only need to look at one triangle. What is the postulate here that I'm going to use based on what's marked? This is also side, side, side. Now, once we have gone through like normal, none of that's new. None of that you've already done. Now, our last statement is going to be, because these triangles are congruent, therefore, I can say these angles are congruent. Even though it's not marked on the picture, if these two triangles are congruent, I know these angles are congruent because of CPCTC. If I have congruent triangles, then their corresponding parts are also congruent. That's what CPCTC says. Corresponding parts, S and A, correspond to each other. A is out over here. They are congruent because I have shown that these triangles are congruent by SSS. That's what we're going to practice tomorrow. All we're going to do is everything we've done like normal, and then tack on one more statement and use CPCTC.